Yo, what's good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Gift of Who's podcast. Had some technical difficulties, but I'm proud to say that I'm here with Noah, passionate Spurs fan, has his own pod that he does. Noah, how are you feeling?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I've done two other podcasts earlier today, so I'm prepped. I'm ready to go. Let's talk some Spurs basketball, man.
The San Antonio Spurs, I think the first thing before we start any conversations is drafting Victor as your franchise player. What we saw from Wemby in his rookie season was absolutely outstanding. But as someone who really follows this team, what was that process like for you in year one?
Yeah, well, I can tell you as somebody who's covered this team for the last 4 years, post DeMar in LMA, it's been really tough. I mean, they're losing a lot of games. Spurs fans were used to them making the playoffs every year, being in contention for something every year, and then they just dropped off the side of the earth, right? I mean, they lost Kawhi. They were losing a ton. They maybe found DeJounte. People were excited about Keldon, and then all of a sudden it was like, yeah, this is for real. Like this team is actually bad. We're not sure what direction they were going in. We're kind of hedging our bets on the lottery, and basketball gods blessed us with that number 1 overall pick, and so just landing Wembanyama changed not only everything, for the franchise, but it changed everything for people who cover this team, whether you're the San Antonio Express News, whether you're Noel McGarr George, whether you're someone with the San Antonio Current, or you're with, Fansided, or you're with, any number of outlets. So it really changed everything for everybody. But just as someone who was kind of along for the ride last season and, got to go to a handful of games as media and just was there with the team, got to speak to players, got to speak to the coach. Just the atmosphere around everything is completely different. A lot of times, even when they were losing, they still had something positive to say. Obviously, Wemby didn't love losing, but I think he understood the long game the Spurs are trying to play, and the Spurs certainly understand really how lucky they got by landing someone like Victor Wembanyama, right? I mean, it's like landing a Timmy. It's like landing a David Robinson, right? I mean, it's generational talent that can take you from zero to hero. So it just was a complete transformation. It almost felt like overnight, even though it was a 22-win season again with Wembanyama on board this time.
I would have to 100% agree with you. It feels like a rebirth in a sense. Like the energy is around San Antonio, and we know that at their best, they were easily one of the most fundamental and well-respected teams in the NBA. So now getting an athlete like him, who is also, a very good player, of course, but in terms of his mindset and his mentality towards how he approaches basketball, he's such a great role model and brand ambassador for the Spurs as well. So having that guy be there as your franchise cornerstone, I know must mean a lot to Spurs fans and people that consistently follow the team every single day. So for him to have the dominant year he did in terms of the way he impacted the game in multiple ways, right? A lot of people highlight his offensive game, his defense, but I feel like the passing is something we don't talk about enough with him. And I like the strategy from the Spurs to not go all in. Okay, he's this great player, so let's make this star trade and have this guy with him. Instead, letting him figure out the game. That's why to me, Chris Paul was such a valuable addition, because it's not going to supersede the growth process, but it gives him a person who understands basketball at a high level to learn the game from. I just think it's a great feeler to aid his overall growth, sure, but still give him room to make those much needed mistakes to become better in every aspect.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, when you look at Victor Wembanyama last season, obviously, they handed him the reins to the offense, right? I mean, he was the guy who took the most shots, who was allowed to make the most mistakes. It's not like they were yanking him from games. They certainly tried to hold him accountable. But one of the things that I really enjoyed, as you mentioned, was the playmaking. They let him experiment as a playmaker. They let him take the ball up the court sometimes. There were a lot of inverted pick and rolls. They even ran some inverted horns pick and rolls where there was 2 guards in those horn sets instead of the 2 bigs at the elbows. So they got a little creative with them. They were able to also see, what can he do as this high post elbow kind of area playmaker. Let's set some screens around him. Let's have some off-ball actions going while he has the ball in his hands, and let's see if he can find guys. And, he made some mistakes. right? He made some mistakes as a playmaker. He made some mistakes as a scorer, but I think that's what's most important when you got a guy like that who is so young, is so talented, and projects to be this guy who, at his peak is probably dominating the touches for your team by a wide margin. You might as well get him used to it, but not overwhelm him. So I like that they were experimenting, but I also like the fact that they had guys like Devin Vassell and Keldon Johnson and Jeremy Sohan, and even, guys like Doug McDermott to a degree who could still take shots. And so you're not forcing this guy to take, like 20 plus shots a night, because I'm not sure exactly what that would have looked like, but I almost guarantee it probably would have been a little bit too much for him. A lot of responsibility to put on his shoulders. So I think easing him into it, but still kind of throwing him into the fire a little bit. They did a good job of balancing those two things for sure.
It's hard. Like it's very hard to do that for a player that wants it. Like he was very upset with the minutes restriction he had early on. And as you saw, as the season progressed, he was a better player for it. And also he stayed durable. I think that's a big part of his, sorry about that. Yeah, but I think that's a huge part of his overall growth during the season. Like it felt like the All-Star break for him was his second year because you saw how different he looked, the way he was impacting defenses, the discipline. People like don't highlight this enough, but even in the Denver game, the way that he was feeling the game out, making the right read, playing well off of his teammates, I think that just speaks to the growth that's there in his overall second year, because to understand what NBA offense and defense is, especially at the big position where there's so much responsibility, there's so much understanding of, okay, how is the ball going to come off? Okay, this guy is a great shooter. Okay, in this set, I need to play drop coverage. Like adjusting on the fly like that on both ends is just very difficult. And he shined in that role. So now having him back for year two should just add to the overall development we can see from him. I mean, he was by far, in a way, one of the best two-way players I've seen in some time. But for him to be number two, basically, in Defensive Player of the Year as a rookie, that's insane impact.
Yeah, I mean, it's unheard of. I mean, he became the youngest all-defense player in NBA history last season. I think he's one of the only rookies ever to be part of an all-defense team, finishing second in Defensive Player of the Year to Rudy Gobert, who in its own right was very deserving of that. But I think if the Spurs were not as bad as they were as a team, I think Wembanyama runs away with that award. Like, this is a guy who was averaging, over 3 blocks a game basically for most of the season. And really, it's insane to think that was just the beginning, right? That's just the rookie season. The last 10 games of his rookie season averaged 26, 12, 6 assists, 5 combined blocks and steals on 45, 35, 80 shooting splits. Like, it's a 10-game sample size, but this is after a long rookie season where I think he only missed something like 9 or 11 games, something in there. So he should have been at his most tired. They had nothing to play for. And this is a guy who still went out there and was like, hey, I've got something to play for. I've got something to prove. And to be honest, as the best player on that team, he didn't really have anything to prove. We knew what he was. We saw what he could do, and he took it to another level at the end of the year. And really, I think, you may not agree with me. I don't know how many people agree with me, but that Denver game, that changed the landscape of the playoffs for the NBA. Like, Denver needed to win that game. They needed to win that game to get the first seed. They didn't win that game. It changed the landscape of the playoffs. So in a way, it felt like a playoff game for the Spurs, even though there was really no consequence for them. But I just was incredibly impressed with what he was able to do at the end of the year, at the Olympics, working with Jamal Crawford. Now he has Chris Paul. I just want to see what year 2 looks like, and it can't come soon enough. It cannot come soon enough.
I'm so happy you said that, because I want you to know I am a strong advocate for that game being a very important game for the history, because that impacted the seeding, which led to Denver having to play a team like they did in the second round, where maybe if the matchups are, a bit different, that changed the entire playoff picture, which also changes who signs where. Like, that type of game really, really matters. And they wanted to win it, but you saw the Spurs not give up. They constantly stayed, poised, and they fought hard, even though their season was done at that point. The fight means something, and that type of energy will carry over into this season. Absolutely. The other thing I wanted to ask you, so I have some friends who are upset at Greg Popovich. I have some who are not. about the Jeremy Sochan experiment at point guard. Do you think that was valuable to see if he could take on that role, or do you think Trey Jones should have been higher elevated earlier on in the season?
No, I mean, when you're as bad as the Spurs projected to be and you have so many young guys and you invested a lottery pick in someone like Sochan, I think you go ahead and you try it out at the beginning of the season. And so I had no issue with them sort of giving it a try. But I think once you saw like 5-6 games into the season where it was pretty apparent that, he couldn't penetrate into the paint. He couldn't get deep, 2 feet in the paint, get deep paint touches. He wasn't able to create advantages. He didn't look comfortable with the ball in his hands. He's not processing the game particularly well when he is also tasked with handling the ball on the perimeter. He's not a guy who can really create his own shot in any way, right? He's not pulling up from mid-range. He's not forcing you to, follow him over a ball screen to stop him from shooting threes. I think once you saw all that stuff wasn't working and it was hurting Jeremy Sochan's confidence after 5 or 6 games, you don't then continue to do that for 20 games. So do I understand why they did it? Yeah, sure. I get it for the first 5 or 6 games, but you carry that on for 22, 23, 24 games. And really you did nothing but slow down the progress for Wembanyama. You slowed down the progress and hurt the confidence of a guy like Jeremy Sochan, who when I was at media day, we were all asking questions, right? People want to know, hey, well, how did this affect you? How did that affect you? We had a reporter from the San Antonio Express News sort of ask him, what did playing point guard, what did you learn? And for me, his biggest takeaway that he told us was, I learned how to find the light when it's dark. And to me, if there's a player who feels like they're going through a dark time when they're playing their sport that they've loved since they were a kid, and now they're getting to do as a professional and make a ton of money, if they feel like they're going through a dark time there, clearly something's off, right? Like, I don't know whether he communicated that to Pop. We're not around them all the time, but it certainly felt like Popovich should have pulled the plug earlier on that and just given the job to Trey Jones. I mean, this is a guy who was the starter for them the previous season. He performed fairly well in that, put up career numbers the previous season. So not starting Trey Jones didn't make a lot of sense. And just for those who don't maybe have a ton of context of what happened last season. So when Trey Jones started last season, the Spurs played at a 30-win pace. So that would have been 8 more wins than the previous season. That would have been pretty good progress, right? When Trey Jones wasn't starting at point guard, so anyone not named Trey Jones, whether you were Malachi Branham, whether you were Blake Wesley, whether you were Jeremy Sochan, they played at a 12-win pace, which would have made them the second worst record in NBA history. And to me, that's just a stark contrast. It's like, nobody was fooled, right? Popovich is not dumb. Clearly he had a reason for doing it, but I think fans have every right to be upset that it lasted too long. Should have pulled the plug earlier. So for me, I get both sides of the coin, but I tend to lean on, it lasted way too long. Should have moved on from that. That ship should have sailed way, way earlier in the season, but it didn't. And, the Spurs just kind of had to suffer for a little bit. So we'll see if it pays off later, because I don't think they're planning on using him as a ball handler at all this season, and not in that capacity.
Yeah, I have to say I 100% am with you. I watch these games and I'm like, I get his value defensively. I think he could be good as a connector piece more so than the primary point guard. And to me, Trey Jones just showed the entire season when he's on the court, he was one of the few guys that could consistently make the correct passes to get everyone involved, especially your franchise player. I mean, their best overall lineup, albeit it is a bit of a limited sample size, was Trey at the 1, Jeremy Sochan at the 2, Vassell at the 3, with Keldon at the 4, and Victor at the 5. That was a plus 25.6 differential overall with Victor at the 5. And we saw the impacts of that because down the stretch, when he started to play more of the 5 position as the season had waned, that was his most productive self. So having Trey Jones be the guy to involve him directly and throw him proper passes, like proper fundamental passes, I think would have really elevated the entire core as a unit, even Sochan himself. And I got to say, I didn't know that he said that, but if he really felt that way, then yes, confidence matters so much in the NBA. You can be as tall, as athletically gifted as you want, but the mental game controls everything in terms of how good you can be. So hopefully he can bounce back this year. But I do think that experiment from Popovich lasted a tad bit too long. you just hope that the lasting effects of that can stay in last year and not this year.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something that Jeremy Sochan's talked about throughout training camp this last week, where he's excited to get back to his position, natural position, playing the 4, maybe sometimes playing the 3 a little bit, being a guy who's running the floor hard in transition, being a guy who can find those cracks in the offense and make those backdoor cuts, someone who crashes the boards, someone who's just more active off ball and doesn't have a ton of on ball responsibilities. He's looking forward to getting back to that. And Popovich has talked about it as well. Like we're excited to see what Jeremy can do, kind of being more comfortable. And so that's why I said earlier, I don't really think we're going to see him used as a, primary ball handler in really any meaningful capacity this season. And I don't think they should. I don't think they should try that again. There's no reason to. And hopefully, like you said, they can kind of leave that in the past and Jeremy can move on. But definitely an interesting player. I know I'm not as high on him as some Spurs fans are, but we can definitely get into that later.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions about the whole core. I think Sochan is a key player, sure, but I think Vassell really pops out to me the most. His spacing, his contract. I just think there's a lot of things about him that, in terms of his overall development, he can be a very key player for this Spurs team. I think that his more so development on ball as well will be a big part of his future with the Spurs. What do you think about Vassell and his role on this team?
Yeah, I think his role kind of shifts a little bit this season with the arrival of Chris Paul. Obviously, Chris Paul is a guy who's been pretty ball dominant his whole career. He's no longer the guy who's going to give you like 25 and 10 every single night. I think realistically, you can probably hope for somewhere around the ballpark of, 12, 4, and 7. Something along the lines of what you got out of Trey Jones, but you're going to get a lot of different intangibles that you didn't get with Trey Jones. And so I think even though he may not be the same player he used to be, he's still going to have the ball in his hands a lot, because one of the things that Popovich told us at Media Day was, what I told Chris Paul was, I just want you to be Chris Paul. We're not changing anything. We're not going to be, forcing you to do something you're uncomfortable with. We want you to go out there, be the Chris Paul you've always been. We'll adapt to you. And so to me, that means Devin Vassell is probably going to see less on-ball reps. He's probably going to see less playmaking reps. He's probably going to be a guy who maybe they run more off-ball actions for, and you see more movement shooting from him this season. And maybe he's a guy who they go to in the clutch. We don't really know what that's going to look like. But unfortunately for Devin Vassell and Spurs fans, the team announced roughly 2 weeks ago that they're not going to reevaluate him until November 1st. And I think that's an important part, is that it's reevaluating. It's not that he's coming back on November 1st. It's that we're going to reevaluate his progress following that June 26th foot surgery. And then we'll see where he is. And they're not, they have zero intentions of rushing him back quickly. So I don't know if it's going to be a Chris Middleton situation where he comes back, they play him, only 20 to 25 minutes a night, and then he's done, right? I don't know how cautious they're going to be. I don't exactly know when to inspect him back, but I think you look, if he comes back at the earliest, let's say mid-November, you've already missed like 10, 12, 13 games of Devin Vassell with this lineup, with some of the new additions in Harrison Barnes and Chris Paul and Stephon Castle. So I think that's a really good question that you asked, and I wish I had a better answer for you, but I don't exactly know what it's going to look like, because we're not going to see Devin Vassell for a little bit. He's going to be on the shelf to begin the year, so it'll be interesting to see how they handle that once he comes back.
Yeah, I saw the report, and I was like, man, that's really tough, because his impact in terms of being able to learn from Chris Paul, being the guard out there, I just think regardless, for all of the young players, being on the court for that process will speak volumes to their growth after this season. And to Absolutely. To not be able to start the year off in that way, it's hard to catch your rhythm to the current NBA speed when you're injured, and how that will overall change the rest of his season remains to be seen. I do think his injury will give more opportunity to some other guys. Maybe Castle gets more minutes now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting and a little funny, because when I went to Media Day, I asked Pop, I was like, this is the question I want to have prepped. I don't know how many questions I'm going to get to ask Pop. So I want to ask him, how does Devin Vassell being on the shelf at the beginning of the season, if in any way, impact how you're going to use Stephon Castle, how much he gets to play? And Pop was pretty short with me. He didn't even really answer my question. He basically was like, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know who's going to start. These guys are going to show me who starts, but, it's too early. I have no idea. And then that was it. He gave me like a little
That's pop.
10-second answer. He gave me the death stare beforehand. So I was like, oh, well, I mean, I got to ask the question, whether he wants to answer it honestly or genuinely, that's up to him. He wasn't feeling it. So I don't exactly know how that's going to look, but my feeling is, at least from the summer league interviews that he gave, the media day interviews that he's given, the training camp interviews that he's been doing, he's pretty high on Stephon Castle. And it sounds like this is a guy who, even if Devin Vassell was healthy, that he would have been an instrumental part of the second unit. Now, I don't think he's going to start, so I don't want people to be disappointed if he's not the starter when Devin Vassell's out. I think he's probably still going to come off the bench, but we might see him, get some more on-ball reps that maybe Devin Vassell would have gotten, right? So we'll see what happens there, but regardless, he's definitely going to be a guy who, at least for me, from what I'm understanding, from the quotes that are given, from the questions that have been asked, from things that have been said, he's definitely going to be a guy who's playing from day one.
I find Castle very interesting as a player as well, because to me, once they drafted Victor, I felt like their timeline was going to be more so young players, but now they're really focusing on the defensive end. Like, I think Castle's impact defensively can be a pretty good player in the future. His offensive game is also very interesting. He has the ability to touch the paint pretty well. I'm curious about his growth with that. I think Chris Paul is like the nice troop that can basically organize the entire floor for these guys. So for their first years, he's going to impact a lot of their value to me, especially early on in the season.
I certainly hope so. I don't want to get people's expectations too high on Stephon Castle, especially because rookies, even when they show a lot defensively in college, even when show a lot defensively overseas, most of the time, rookies are almost always net negatives, especially the rookies that play, over 15, 20 minutes per game, and they're asked a lot of. Now, I think it probably makes the most sense to just get him a few on-ball reps here or there, but mostly let him be what he was at UConn, which was mostly a connector, a guy who's making those cuts off ball, a guy who's running hard in transition, and then occasionally a guy who can attack off second side actions and make plays when the defense collapses on him. But I mean, honestly, Stephon Castle to me was an interesting pick because the Spurs have Trey Jones. Obviously, we didn't know they were going to sign Chris Paul at that point yet, but having Chris Paul, having Trey Jones, if you really pick him at the fourth pick, even without knowing you're going to get Chris Paul, to me, that signals that you believe in him as a point guard because you already have your shooting guard of the future in Devin Vassell. This is a guy who's not a particularly good shooter. And so what are you going to do? You're not going to just station him out there as a catch and shoot guy because he was basically left wide open at UConn. People dared him to shoot. So I think the pick is really interesting, and it definitely signals that they see some point guard in him, but I just don't know. And I don't mean to be a hater in any way. I always just try to keep things realistic. I've watched a lot of these guys since they were in high school, since they were in college, and I understand Stephon Castle was an elite level high school point guard, but most people I don't think have this grasp that being elite level high school point guard does not make you an elite level college point guard. And then now going from college, having not really played point guard, having some on-ball responsibilities, mostly being a connector, to now, he was really good in high school at this role, so he's going to be good at it in the NBA. That's a massive jump. Going from high school to college, insane jump. Going from college to the NBA, even bigger jump. So, the Spurs saw something that maybe we didn't see, and they have a scouting department. They get paid the big bucks, so I will trust them on this one. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But that being said, just from my own personal analysis of him, I just don't, at the moment, see it. I love him as a connector. I love him as a jack of all trades, as a guy who's going to get in your face and be a disruptive point of attack defender. But I don't know if I see, full-time point guard of the future. But, in a weaker class, if you take him forward, it's not going to look that bad probably in the long run if that doesn't end up being his role long-term.
Yeah, I thought the pick was very interesting for all of the reasons you said. I think the reason why they probably feel like they can draft him with this skill set is because of the unicorn that Wemby is positionally. And if he's able to transfer his athleticism with his defense as well, that is ideally a player that could be a solid enough connector piece. Maybe he'll be more like a Jalen Suggs-esque, where it's like, sure, you can pass but like your main value is going to be from the defensive end. I can see that having positives, but I don't want people to put a lot of pressure because you're right. Translating from high school to college is hard. Translating from college to the NBA is hard. Translating a high school skill set to the NBA is very hard. So it's going to take some time. And I think the Spurs are really of the mindset that they're going to use Victor in a different type of way to where he's going to be 5, but I think you're going to see a lot of moments where he is the de facto point center, and they want to get as much defense and shooting around that. And I think putting athletes next to Victor isn't a bad call either. But again, it's still super duper early. We have to see how these things officially play out on the basketball floor.
Absolutely. And I think if you want to be optimistic, and I do encourage fans, be optimistic. That's what fans are for, right? Fans should be optimistic. Fans should get excited about these things. If I'm looking for one thing to be optimistic about Stephon Castle's long-term outlook and his high-end outcome, I'm looking right at the Oklahoma City Thunder and what happened with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Chris Paul 3-4 years ago, where, Chris Paul arrives in town. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander wants to be a sponge. Chris Paul is willing to be a mentor. The two connect on more than just a basketball level, but they become friends. They hang out a lot outside of basketball. When they're on the court together, it's student, it's teacher, and it's a willing student, and it's a teacher who can impart a world of knowledge because he is that all NBA level, future Hall of Fame level basketball mind, right? So if he is able to have a similar impact on Stephon Castle, and Stephon Castle is able to round out his game learning from Chris Paul, I think that's the best case scenario. Obviously, a lot else is going to have to happen. Stephon Castle is going to have to become a lot better shooter. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander had a higher baseline as a shooter than Stephon Castle did. But I think Stephon Castle, really strong, plays at his own pace, thinks the game at a high level. We saw him be able to hit those corner skips out of the pick and roll. He's able to manipulate the defense a little bit with his eyes. He's able to hit the pocket pass. He's able to thread the needle between guys. He's able to hit the wraparound when he gets 2 feet in the paint to his big. So there's a lot of promise there. But I think at the end of the day, for defenses to respect him, he's going to have to develop a shot. He's going to have to become a threat, at least as a mid-range pull-up guy. And most of the time, guys do not get to be a mid-range pull-up guy unless you're a star. So we'll see what happens with Stephon Castle. But look at that SGA and CP3 connection and hope that that's what you can get out of that for a guy like Stephon Castle.
And this kind of goes back to what we said earlier, right? Victor Wembanyama is such an intriguing player in his skill sets and everything that he can do, that I think the Spurs are trying to do their best to not pigeonhole him into playing one type of role where he can fit into many different types of aspects. But part of me would want them to be a bit cautious with that, because if you think that he's just so good, we can afford to put X or Y or Z around him, you might wind up not maximizing the full window compared to just saying, no, he'll be this. And then you have a much more concretely defined fits around him, right? Because honestly, the spacing in the modern game is so important. If you're leaning on your big to be that, and then you just have clunky fits around him, that puts more pressure on Wemby to have to be Wemby compared to saying, hey, here's passing, here's defense, and here's, guys who can really shoot the basketball. So I'm curious about how this all pans out, but I'm assuming that the on-ball reps for Victor, especially in the half-court set, will go up. The inverted pick and rolls, I love them. I would love to see more and more and more of those. And I kind of want to ask you this too. In terms of Wemby, how do you view building a proper front court around him? Like, is Keldon Johnson a guy that you like, that archetype of big next to him at like the 4, really 3 spot? Or do you think the small 4, power forward positions nearby him should look different?
Yeah, I think ideally you have somebody who maybe is like, and I know these players are very different, but a guy like maybe a Jonathan Isaac who, can shoot the ball a little bit as a standstill shooter, is a guy who's a defensive event creator, a guy who provides length, who can, make up for some of the mistakes that other guys make. And there's not so much pressure on Wembanyama to, okay, you have to save us every possession rather defensively, right? So I'd love that. I also think if you're just looking for a guy who's a rock solid defender who can, maybe he's not getting a ton of steals or blocks per game and he's not necessarily locked down, but he gets his job done most of the time, but provides more value offensively, I think you're looking at someone like a PJ Washington. So I like that kind of archetype around him. And, unfortunately, I think a lot of people really, really feel, especially Spurs fans, feel this really strong attachment to Keldon Johnson. And they think, oh, well, he's PJ Washington. He's not. He's not. He's not as good of a shooter. He's not a consistent shooter. He's not as good of a defender. He's not quite as big. He doesn't quite have as good of a grasp on his defensive responsibilities. And so, I like Keldon Johnson. I think in theory, what you might get out of Keldon Johnson, that's what you are getting out of PJ Washington on a nightly basis. So someone like a PJ Washington would be really cool to have next to Wembanyama. But right now, unfortunately, they don't really have that on the roster. I mean, the closest thing you can probably approximate that to is Keldon Johnson. I mean, really, truthfully, that's probably, Keldon Johnson. Yeah. And that's not to say he's a bad player. He's not a bad player by any means, but defensively, the metrics don't look good. The tape will show you he's late on rotations. He misses his responsibilities sometimes. He gets caught ball watching. He doesn't necessarily have the quickest feet to stay with guards, but he's not necessarily strong enough to deal with traditional forwards. And, while I'm really happy that he lost 10 to 15 pounds this offseason, he's super trim. He looks like he's in phenomenal shape. He's mostly played power forward. So unless he's, thinking he's going to be moved to shooting guard or, a wing position full time, I don't know what losing all that weight does for him, because he's not a guy who's playing 30 plus minutes a night. He's a guy who probably is playing 25, 20 minutes per night. And so if you have him matched up against bigger guys now, they're going to get through him a little bit easier. But like, losing weight doesn't make you see the game any differently. So until Keldon Johnson can show me that he did get in the film room and he reevaluated how he looks at the game and he's going to pay closer attention to detail, then to me, great. I'm glad he's leading a healthier lifestyle. I'm glad that maybe he'll be a little bit quicker laterally. But at the end of the day, I just don't know how much it's going to do for him. So while I hope it does have an impact on him positively, Keldon Johnson is still not close to a guy like PJ Washington. And I think ideally, hopefully that's someone that you can't get on your roster, but you want a player who's somewhat similar like that next to Wemby.
Yeah, I couldn't, people have to understand, PJ Washington specifically, he was a player that had a lot of overall versatility. There were some areas where he could be better at for sure, but when Dallas made the trade for him, that type of player who can really impact the game defensively, who can actually catch the ball, attack a closeout, and get fouled, that stuff type of matters, right? And the attention to detail. Both are young players, but Keldon Johnson at times leaves a lot to be desired there. I think the proper answer to building a front court around Wemby is less so the play style as much and more so, can they understand the game at a high level? Are they prepared to hedge over screens? Can they pass the ball? Can they rotate at the right time? My type of big that I would love to put around him is probably a big similar to maybe Aaron Gordon. Hard to do. Yeah. Hard to find players like that, but guys that understand their roles to a T and can also ball handle. If you put a ball handling four-man next to Victor, those two-man games are going to be devastating, especially if they build the other three men in space.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. And I think that's kind of what they, or at least I don't want to speak for the Spurs, but I think that's what some Spurs fans think they have in Sochan. But again, for as inconsistent as Aaron Gordon can be year to year as a shooter, defenses still respect him enough not to leave him completely wide open. And there were only, last time I checked, and I'd have to look at the stats again, but there were only 2 or 3 players who shot more wide open threes than Sochan. And so what that tells me is guys are fine to let him shoot. They're going to dare him to shoot. They're going to sag off of him. And if they're sagging off of him, that crowds the rest of the court, right? It shrinks the floor. So one, you're not getting the same amount of spacing, though admittedly, Aaron Gordon is not an elite floor spacer by any stretch of the imagination, but he has the respect of defenses not to necessarily shrink the floor to the degree that Sochan does. Two, I think Aaron Gordon is a really high-level processor of the game. He's a really smart passer. They use him as a short roll passer too, as a screener in those 4-5 pick and rolls with a guy like Nikola Jokic. And number three, he is a guy who is an above the rim athlete who is elite in transition. And on top of all of this, you also have a guy in Aaron Gordon who defensively, most nights you think, okay, I can stick him on the best guy on the other side and he's going to get the job done. He is going to come up with steals. He's going to come up with weak side blocks occasionally. He's not necessarily the best event creator, but he's a guy who's making things happen. And unfortunately, again, I don't mean to be a hater, but you look at Sochan and you talked about it, right? You want a guy who can kind of handle the ball. Sochan has looked uncomfortable. Guys get under his handle, right? Okay, well, can he shoot? No, he can't shoot. Well, does he process the game at the same level as an Aaron Gordon? No, he doesn't. Not right now, at least. Okay, so is he as good of an athlete as Aaron Gordon? No. Okay, well, does he run the floor and have as efficient point per possession numbers in transition as Aaron Gordon? Well, no, he doesn't have that either. So while I think you can look at Aaron Gordon and Jeremy Sochan and draw some similarities between the two, I just don't think there's a real comparison there as far as a 1-for-1. There's no 1-for-1 with any two players, but certainly at this point in his career, Sochan is not an approximate for what you get out of a guy like Aaron Gordon. So I agree with you. That would be a really awesome player to have around him, the PJ Washington type, but as well. But I just don't know where they get it. And maybe they get it in the upcoming draft. Maybe they swing a trade because they have a ton of draft capital. But right now, I just have a lot of questions about a lot of the other young guys on the roster, not named Devin Vassell or Victor Wembanyama. So, then that's for them to figure out. They're still early into this thing, but I think you want to start getting those things sorted out sooner than later.
Yeah, it's funny because that was actually going to be my next question, because how I view the Spurs is this is a team that is very much so trying to figure out who their core is. If you have to ask me, I think the only two players that are their real core would be Victor and would be Vassell, based off their, skill sets and what they have shown that they can reach, right? I think this is a very, very young team. Guys are trying to solidly turn into real pros at a high level. And all of the traits that we are talking about are more so found in players that have been in the league 6 years, 7 years, 8 years. And a player like Gordon has seen playoff success, has seen a NBA Finals, right? Like he's seen that, and he's seen these types of reps. He's also a player that, was young and then learned and then overall developed into the player that he is now. So to me, it's not hate to say that these traits don't exist. I think it's important to highlight that and see, okay, what can the Spurs do to create these, to help develop these in their guys? And I think the other thing that's very interesting about the Spurs as well is their cap space. I think in a Victor rebuild, the cap space and the structuring of contracts and pros and buying high on guys at the right time really, really, really matters to create a cohesive unit for the next 4 to 5 years.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right on that one. And that's why I really like the Devin Vassell deal, because I think at the time of signing it, he hadn't necessarily proved a ton, but it's shown enough flashes that you're like, okay, I believe in this guy to get to a next gear. And I think last year he showed that he could get to another gear. And you look at his contract in the first 2 years of this extension that kicks in this year, the numbers go up. I think it's something like 27 million, 28 and a half mil. And then in year 3, it goes back down to 27 mil. And I think it plateaus at that for the 4th year. So I think you look at it and, whoa, 27 million for a guy who's not an all-star, a guy who you're not sure if he's number 2 or number 3 long-term and on a championship contender. But how I look at it is every year the cap is going to go up and up. And the percentage of the cap that it is today, I believe it's something along the lines, and I'd have to double check and you can fact check on me later, but I believe it's somewhere in the realm of like 15 to 17% of the cap right now. So as the cap continues to go up and his number on his contract every year doesn't really rise by a ton and then goes back down and plateaus, he's eating into less and less and less of the cap every year. And that offers you so much financial flexibility. Another guy like Keldon, even for everything that I've said about him, how I'm not really sure where he fits in. I'd love to see him do X, Y, Z more. He's another guy who signed an extension that ultimately, at the end of the day, not that much money, doesn't eat that much into your cap. So if he's a guy who you go, okay, I like him as a sixth man, spark plug, he can score the ball, he can shoot a little bit, he can attack a closeout, he runs hard in transition. Okay. Like, by the time he gets to his next deal, I think the Spurs will be more realistic, and probably the agents will be more realistic with, this is what he does, this is what his role is. He's probably not going to get another big extension like that. So I think they have a lot of financial flexibility, and they're not locked into a lot of these guys long term. They really are not.
Yes. And all that stuff matters when you're trying to construct a good basketball team, because the new CBA is very limiting to teams, right? So players like Aaron Gordon have contracts that are coming up. And if Denver cannot re-sign him, maybe he's a veteran piece that says, okay, you know what? I won. Let me play with a great player. Let me see how it is to be a part of the, Spurs team and culture. And then you build off of that. I think that's really the lane that the Spurs are trying to go into, while also fully developing their guys. I also love the assets, right? The DeJounte trade was a success for the Spurs, a massive one at that too.
Yes, man, dude. I mean, they could not have gotten a better return for DeJounte Murray. I mean, talk about selling high, 3 unprotected. I think 2 pick swaps, something along those lines. Dude, that's massive for them. I don't think that can be understated. And through all of it, getting rid of DeJounte Murray, which I think at the time a lot of Spurs fans were upset about. This is a guy who, franchise record and triple doubles in a season, your first All-Star since DeMar DeRozan, I believe, in 2019. Fans were incredibly upset. But at the end of the day, not only did it get you all those picks, but it puts you in a position to be bad enough, and I know that sounds bad, but it puts you in a position to be bad enough to have a shot at landing Wembanyama, and it paid off. So not only did you land Wembanyama, but now you've got control of the Hawks picks. And I think if you look at this from the Spurs point of view, I don't know that trade made sense for Atlanta, but for the Spurs, it certainly made sense to go, okay, they're kind of desperate. They want to win something. They want to capitalize on their recent Eastern Conference Finals appearance. They're going to do anything they can to get that piece. And so now when you think of it, when you're the Spurs going, yeah, I don't know how that's going to work out. That's how I saw it. When they traded that, I was like, I'm not sure how that marriage between those two guys is going to work out. Didn't necessarily work out like they hoped. They had to move DeJounte. They didn't get as much for DeJounte as the Spurs got for DeJounte. And now you are in control of their picks. So no matter how bad they are, you're going to have at least 3 of their picks. And if they are really bad and they blow this thing up, well, there you go.
I draft picks
in the driver's seat.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that fans grew an attachment to what they saw DeJounte Murray do, but the way the NBA moves, things move and happen so fast. If you don't sell high on players, you wind up in a position where, okay, we're asset strapped, we can't really improve, we're kind of in the middle, and no fan wants to be in the middle. They want to have a clear direction, and I think drafting a player like Victor put them in that clear overall guide of where we're trying to go. The unprotecteds with the cap space is their best way to maximize that type of player. So seeing that pan out, however it does, is something that very deeply interests me, especially with the way that they've handled contracts, right? Again, people thought that at the time, okay, Devin Vassell might be making a whole lot of money. I hear that, but with the cap going up, we're going to have to get used to these numbers and more so hard focus on the percentage of the cap they are having. 15% for a player of his size that's still super duper young, who could be way better, is not bad at all. It's great value.
Absolutely. And I know I think I mentioned his name a little bit earlier, but if Devin Vassell can look at Chris Middleton as a sort of archetype for him to follow, a guy who, can get to his mid-range spots, can pull up from 3, can self-create, can play make for others to a degree, and kind of be that Batman to Robin, like, that's what Chris Middleton has been for a guy like Giannis. If he can get to that level and he can see, hey, that's kind of like the role I can play for the Spurs, that's huge. Like if he can even just get to that level where he's, number 2, number 3 on a championship team, and he's, a fringe all-star every year, and maybe gets a couple all-star appearances, and not a perennial all-star guy, not a guy who you build a whole team around, but certainly is that guy who really comes in and provides that scoring support that you need, some playmaking support. Yeah, huge for the Spurs. That deal will look like a no-brainer in a few years if that's what it ends up looking like.
And that kind of brings me to my next question, because I feel like when you're looking at the next years of the Spurs and how things are, my biggest question is, will Greg Popovich still be in leadership of the Spurs for the next 3 to 4 years? Or do you think his timeline is more so coming to an end? Me personally, I think the drafting of a player this good in Wemby is going to extend his time longer than most might think.
Yeah, I kind of tend to think that he's going to be here for the rest of his contract. I know he signed that 5-year extension, and there's an out at every year. Like, so at the end of every year, he could opt to not come back, and
Right.
no harm, no foul or anything like that. But that's how his last contract was structured. And I remember, one of the big things that he had talked about was, I told these guys, DeMar, LaMarcus, that, I'm here as long as they're here. I'm not going to, recruit them to come here. I'm not going to trade for you and then just abandon you. Like, I'm going to see this thing through. And so while there's no real older all-star player like that, I think landing someone like Victor Wembanyama changes your outlook. And, I hate to bring people's personal lives into this, because I think, that's their personal life, their private life. We don't know a lot about them behind the scenes, because we only see them when they're on TV, when they're on the basketball court, when they're on the sidelines. But having lost his wife a couple of years ago amid the Kawhi Leonard debacle, that's a huge life-changing event. And he's a guy who, he's in his mid-70s now. His kids are grown. His kids have kids. They're living their own lives. I think it's really tough, at least how I imagine him seeing this. And again, I can't really speak for him, but how I would see it is, this is keeping me busy. This is keeping me engaged. This still gives me this opportunity to have these personal interactions with people on a daily basis and help them grow and continue to be a mentor and, make the most of my mind while I still have it. And, he's a legendary coach, and he's a guy who has over the last couple of years spoken really highly about the newfound joy of being able to coach young players, something that he has talked about. He felt he kind of missed out on with, Tony Parker and Manu and Boris Diaw and Bruce Bowen and Tim Duncan. Like, these are guys who they didn't need a lot of coaching, right? They understood what the job was. They were generational talents in their own right. They were, seasoned veterans who understood their role. He doesn't need to give them a lot of guidance, but he's really spoken highly about that experience of being able to now kind of walk these young guys down and teach them, this is what you need to do here. This is how you need to be in this situation. This is the place you need to be standing on the court. These are the things you need to be looking at in the film room. And so I think it really gives him an outlet to continue to be an important part of San Antonio's community as well, right? As sort of like a de facto, like kind of godfather of San Antonio too, because he's very active in social justice efforts, in getting people registered to vote, in doing community service things. So I just don't see him abandoning this post anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think for a young team to know that you have that is pretty big, because it makes you understand that my development, my aid here is not going to be alone. I have a core system of people that I know I can trust to help me become a better player as I, grow. And I think for Wemby, it just speaks volumes to have a player like that there, and to have someone like Popovich who's just in your ear every single time telling you, you did this wrong, you did this right, like keeping him humble, I think is very big for him, because I think players like that don't come often. He's a generational asset, and to see his growth really, really matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't understate the importance of having a guy who commands respect upon entering a room. There are a lot of coaches around the NBA who are new coaches or newer coaches, even if they've been around the block for 4 or 5 seasons, who they haven't really proven anything. So even if you sign guys, recruit guys, trade for guys, they may not come into your facilities or your building or your arena and go, well, yeah, I need to listen to him, or, oh, I need to respect him. A lot of those guys are still going, you got to prove something to me, or why aren't you playing me this often? Or why aren't we doing things this way? When you're Popovich and you have 25 plus, almost 3 decades worth of experience, 5 championships, a bunch of, Western Conference Finals appearances, the most regular season wins in NBA history, guys come into your building and they understand all right, I got to buy in. Like, I want to learn everything I can. This is a guy who's reached the pinnacle of his career, who's one of the GOATs in his profession. I just need to sit here and soak up all the knowledge I can. So I think having a guy like that who just commands respect, and a guy like Wembanyama too, who wants to learn, that's a perfect marriage. So I think you can't understate how important it is to have those two guys together.
And that brings me to this next part here, right? So in terms of 2025, what do you think is the biggest goal of improvement for the Spurs? What do they need to hit in terms of benchmarks to make this a successful season in their eyes?
I don't know, because they aren't very forthcoming. You know, a lot of us ask questions to the players and Pop, like, you know, what's the goal this season? And basically their answers are just, you know, I want to be as good as I can be. I'm trying to, you know, hit this developmental goal, or, you know, we never have a set number of wins we're looking for. We're never just trying to make the playoffs. We just want to be the best we can be. So I don't know what they're looking for, but I can tell you, if I'm the Spurs, if I'm operating in their front office, I'm looking for, you know, 35, 36 wins, tangible improvement, especially during those clutch time situations. And I think in crunch time, having a guy like Chris Paul and a guy like Harrison Barnes to sort of organize the troops, if you will, kind of settle guys down, that's going to be huge for them, because the Spurs were in a lot of close games last year that they lost simply because they had inexperience, right? They lacked the experience. Yeah. They lacked the know-how. They lacked somebody who could be that steadying presence, a good decision maker, right? Like they committed a lot of turnovers. So they had a lot of games where they were up 13-14 at halftime. They didn't respect the lead. They didn't know how to keep their foot on the gas, and they lost games. So I think just having guys around like that can help them finish games, can help them maintain leads. And I think hopefully, if you're the Spurs, your goal is, let's win some more games this year. You don't have to put a tangible number on that, but I want to see us make a progress in that area as far as the decision making goes, as far as the mental aspects of the game go. So I know a little bit of a cookie cutter answer, but I think that's kind of what they're looking for this season, is just how can we be tangibly better?
That I would say for me, what I looked at was mainly the composure being better, because as you said, I believe some hard cracking in terms of the numbers. I think the Spurs were the number one team in terms of 10-point deficits that were given up, where they're up 10 and then all of a sudden everything balloons up and now they're down 10 or worse, and then they wind up not actually winning the game. Chris Paul, to me, is the embodiment of that is what his value is at this point. A stopgap player to calm everyone down, reaffirm people of their confidence in their roles, and get the offense more structured. And it felt like towards the end of the year, you saw the Spurs figuring out some more of those pieces, especially Wemby. I thought the way that he closed out his year, he was absolutely dominant on both ends of the ball. And just having that type of composure on both ends, just calm down and say, okay, let's just keep doing what got us this lead. Let's not overreact. Let's not deviate from that. And, you know, having that mindset and being better in those spots, to me, will translate to them winning more games. I mean, people really forget they play competitive teams very well. I'll never forget the Suns. Like, I watched all of those games. They played them very, very well, routinely, right? Even the Bucks, very, very well. They do these things. So to me, based off of their confidence in those aspects, just having more organization in themselves will translate.
I agree with you. I think that's really the value of Chris Paul and Harrison Barnes at this point. I don't expect them to be guys who come in and give you, 25-10 or 15-6-3. Like I don't expect that from them. But what I do expect them to do, again, as we've talked about, is just be that steadying presence. You saw the Spurs get sped up a lot towards the end of games. They were taking shots early into shot clocks, or they were making bad entry passes, or they were forcing passes into windows that didn't necessarily exist. Or you saw them, they sort of panicked defensively. They weren't communicating. They were sort of pointing the finger like, you were supposed to be there. You were supposed to be there. And just having guys who've been there before, who've lived that, who've won championship in a guy like Harrison Barnes, or who have played at the highest levels of the game like Chris Paul. You really there's nothing that can equal that. That is invaluable for them. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I would say the last thing I want to ask you about, in terms of just the NBA landscape as a whole, what are you most excited for this season? And what do you think the state of the Western Conference is more than ever?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna zig a little bit here because I don't think most Spurs fans probably care too much about this team, but I'm really excited for the reestablishing of the Memphis Grizzlies. Really big fan of Ja Morant. They added Zach Edey. They still have most of that young core together in Jaren Jackson Jr. and Desmond Bane. They've got some really interesting pieces on that roster, and a coach in Taylor Jenkins who came through the Spurs system, was the former Austin Spurs head coach, had a chance to be tutored by Greg Popovich, a guy who, when they're healthy, has proven to be a very, very good coach and gets the most out of his guys and is creative and also gets his point across what he wants them to be as far as their identity defensively, offensively. So I'm excited for that because I think a lot of people forgot this is a team that was like the number 2 seed a few years ago, I think in back-to-back years with like 56 and 52 wins, something like that. So I'm really excited for that, and especially excited to see Ja Morant healthy and on the court, because regardless of what anybody thinks of what happened off the court or him not staying healthy, this is a dude who, to me, was on a trajectory to put himself in that MVP conversation, at least top 5, top 6, year in and year out. And I really hope we see that again, because what a joy it was to watch him play basketball and just dart down the court and finish over guys and play make. And I've missed it. I've missed it a lot. So I'm really excited for that.
I'm very surprised by that zig. It's also funny because I recently put out a pod I did with some people who are creators for Memphis, and I agree. Memphis is a team that has been slept on repeatedly, and I learned my lesson the last time I picked against them to be such a high seed. And I feel like the way they're structured as a team defensively, where yes, Steven Adams is gone, but Zach Edey, in terms of how big he is and how he can set big body screens to free up the lanes for Ja Morant, really is going to be good. Ja also is a player that is supremely skilled. When he came back, they were winning many games. They went on a win streak. His first game was a game winner, right? So to me, him being able to come back and establish himself, and also a player like Desmond Bane, who year after year after year gets better, where, he worked to get himself a max a contract now, but in terms of his overall game growing from just, a standstill 3-point shooter to a guy that can operate in pick and rolls, a guy who can get downhill, a guy who is, growing his mid-range area, right? The growth in a lot of these players really speaks volumes to how nice of a team they can be. I'm a bit concerned because they cannot beat the injury bug stuff.
I know.
They have a lot of key players going down at the wrong time. You'd never want a lot of your key players going down before the season, especially with the Spurs, like their next best player also going down. It just hurts. And that is going to be a hard thing for them to fight through, because remember, in the Western Conference, we've seen so many changes, but at the beginning, that's the moment where you kind of want to be good, because if you're not, down the stretch, those games in January, December, like those are the games that matter by the end.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And I think when you fall behind the 8 ball at the beginning of the season, it can derail things for the rest of the year. Like, you don't want to be a team that starts slow, because now you're making up for it for the rest of the season. And whether you want to admit it or not, as a team, as a player, as a coach, that does affect you mentally. Like, you do really, everybody subconsciously realizes when, oh man, I'm behind, I need to make up for this. Or if we don't win this game, then we're further behind in the standings in this area, or we're further into the play-in, or we're not in the playoff picture. Those sort of things do matter. And so when I look at the, Western Conference this season, it's going to be really important for a lot of these teams, especially the ones that are fully healthy entering the year, to come out of the gates hot. Because if they don't, there will be other teams that are absolutely ready to capitalize on their slow start. And just looking at the Western Conference, there's so many teams that I think can be playoff teams, that we're going to have teams that probably would make the playoffs in the Eastern Conference or in a normal year that are just in the play-in picture and might even miss out in the play-in picture. I mean, I'm looking at the Nuggets, the Lakers, the Grizzlies, the Thunder, the Kings, the Suns, the Rockets, the Mavericks, the Pelicans, Timberwolves, Warriors. You know, I'm not super high on the Jazz being a lot better this year, or the Blazers being that good, or the Spurs even really being that good, or the same thing with the Clippers. But that's 11 teams that, you know, you could make an argument they
Very
have a
competitive.
chance at the playoffs, right? So I think it's going to be another bloodbath, so to speak, in the Western Conference, where every night you better be ready to bring your best, or you're going to be losing footing to somebody else who is willing to step up, or a team that has stepped up. So I'm excited to see what happens this season, because I think it's going to be just as unpredictable as it has been in recent years.
And tying that part back into the pod, by the way, this is what the Spurs versus Denver game was last year, where a tough team was fighting for positioning. They lose that game, and then all of a sudden the fate of the playoffs changes. I think the Spurs are going to be one of those teams where teams are going to be tired from, you know, having to play. If they take them lightly and they're more structured, they're going to get their wins in those areas. Night after night, I could easily see that.
Yeah, I think if you sleep on a lot of these teams, they'll come back to bite you. I mean, the Spurs have seen that when they were good, right? Even when the Spurs are winning 56, 57, 58 games, there's those nights that if you don't have that attention to detail, you don't have that respect, maybe you're on the second night of a back-to-back and you're tired and they've got fresh legs and they're younger than you, yeah, you can lose. I mean, it's easy to forget, even for teams that are very, very bad. Everyone is very, very good at basketball. Everybody can have their night. Every dog has their day. So you've just got to be ready to come in there, give 100%, be, you know, on the ball, and just not drop the ball, right? You don't want to be that guy who, or that team that, hey, I didn't have the proper level of fear, and now you've lost to a team like the Jazz or a team like the Spurs. And I could very well see the Spurs being that team that, you know, one win here for them or one loss here for them absolutely impacts other teams' playoff chances.
100%. The very last thing for the 2025 draft, a lot of people say that this is a very important draft. Players like Ace Bailey, Flag. What player do you think interests you the most in terms of a potential fit on this Spurs team?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the obvious one is going to be a guy like Cooper Flag. I think that's the dream scenario, is you land a guy like Cooper Flag who, you know, he's still figuring things out offensively, right? Mostly right now, he's a guy who can attack closeouts, who can get downhill in transition, a guy who can be a play finisher. But defensively, another one of those guys where if Wembanyama did not exist, he's another one of those guys who you could easily label generational defender. And so having a guy who is a, you know, quote unquote, once in a lifetime sort of a perimeter defensive prospect, and then he has so much left to scratch on the surface as an offensive talent, but he still has that base of being able to attack closeouts, shoot the three ball a little bit, you know, run in transition. My goodness, like we just talked about guys who could be the perfect fit next to Wembanyama. I can't think of someone better.
That is a terrifying front court,
like Cooper Flag, right? Like that would be a very interesting combination for sure. And, you know, there are other players in there and we can talk about them if we have time here, but Cooper Flag is definitely the number one guy, right? But you also have to get lucky and land that first pick.
Yeah, I'm very curious in terms of what the draft lottery holds. I definitely have time because the Spurs are so confusing because there's so many ways they can go through, right? Where it could be another front court player or they reposition. I kind of feel like Castle, I think they are committed to seeing what he'll be as a point guard, which makes me feel a bit iffy because there are some better point guard prospects potentially in this 2025 draft. But outside of Flag, who are some prospects that really intrigue you?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give you the name that maybe we're not expecting to go over just because we talked about the Spurs maybe are committed to Castle as a point guard, and who knows what they're going to do with Chris Paul, and they've got Trey Jones. But I'm going with Nolan Traore. I think he's a guy who's been on a heater at the beginning of the season in the LMB Pro A League over in France. He, I think, had 20 and 10 today. I think the previous game he had something like 32 and 8. So he's playing in the best league in France. The French league is, top 5 league in the world. This is the same league that Wembanyama came from. This is a guy who's a teenager who he's got a ton of burst. He's shown the ability to pull up from multiple levels, so he has that 3-level scoring potential, and he's someone who at least has the tools that he could be a disruptive defender. And I think he's a guy who sees the game at a really high level. He's a really, not just a guy who makes the routine passes, but he can, play make for others and make those more advanced reads. So even though they may feel like, hey, I really like Stephon Castle, one thing that my podcast co-host Gabe talks about all the time is once the train leaves the station, you cannot just slow it down to let everybody else catch up. So if they see a guy who they go, man, this guy really, he fits our timeline, I think he's a better prospect, you can't then just pass up on him because you go, well, we also invested in Stephon Castle. Well, guess what? If you have an opportunity to add a player who you think is a better point guard prospect, who has a higher ceiling, who maybe can come in from day one and play that role a little bit better, you take it. You take it. Unless there's a glaring need somewhere else and that other prospect is on that same echelon, then you take them. And so for me, Nolan Traore definitely fits that mold. He's not a guy who we're looking at, did he play well in high school at point guard? No, man. This is a guy who's been a pro for a couple of years. This is a guy who's playing at the highest level right now, and he's doing his job at a really, really high level as a teenager in one of the best leagues in the world. So you don't just pass up on a guy like that because you drafted Stephon Castle 4th. And I think the beauty in Stephon Castle is he can be a connector. He can be that point of attack defender. He can be a guy who's moving off ball as a cutter. He's a guy who we know is an excellent screen setter as a guard. Really, really strong. Fights for boards. Cleans the glass. This is a guy who, even if he does not work out as a point guard, he's sort of a jack of all trades. He's going to find a way to stick. He's going to find a way to make an impact when he's out there. We saw that at UConn. So even if he's not a point guard, guess what? You can slot him in elsewhere. And that's something that Pop has talked about too. I could see him playing the 1. I could see him playing the 2. I could see him playing the 3. Well, guess what? You take Traore, you don't have to change plans. You just have to tweak them just a little bit. So I really like Nolan Traore for the Spurs.
I love that mindset too, because great organizations can understand the importance of valuing your commitment, but all-time organizations understand to accept that and move on if you think you found a thing that's better. Don't let that stop you for, oh, you know what? We have too many guards. I can't draft Luka Doncic. Yeah, draft Luka Doncic, right? So I'm not mad at that at all. I think Castle as a connector piece is a huge part of his value because it can scale with other players. Being a connector is so critical for that very reason. So I'm not mad at that at all. That makes sense.
Yeah, really love Traore. Would love to have Cooper Flagg. But as you mentioned, there's a few other names in there that, if the Spurs end up landing those guys like the Ace Bailey, I wouldn't be upset about that either, because at the end of the day, this is a class that has just so much higher ceiling at the top. It's a top-heavy class. It's a class that a lot of people who, smarter than me have gone, oh, man, you got to get in on this talent. Well, guess what? The Spurs have a ticket of their own, possibly, and a lottery pick of their own lottery pick if they land in the lottery, which I think they probably will. And they have an opportunity to land another lottery pick with Atlanta's pick if Atlanta ends up kind of disappointing and maybe they blow things. You never know, right? You never know. And you've also got other picks. You've got the 2025 Hornets pick. You've got the 2025 Bulls pick. So if you're able to package things together, maybe you can move up a few spots. Anything can happen. But if I'm the Spurs, Cooper Flagg, Traore, those are the 2 guys who are 1 and 2 on my priority list for sure.
Great. Well, I want to say, Noah, I really appreciate you. This was a very fun pod. We have a lot in common in terms of how we view the Spurs and also the NBA. So great conversation. Currently, I'm sick. I try to fight through my personal afflictions and whatnot, but that was a great conversation. People who've made this far, make sure to tap into all of Noah's content. It will be in the description box below. You do great work, man. I was very happy to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. And let me tell you, thank you so much for bringing me on. I always love the opportunity to talk about the Spurs, to talk about NBA basketball. And I especially love talking basketball with people who love the game, who kind of see the game in a similar light that I do. So I really enjoyed this. I had a blast talking basketball. And again, just thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with somebody who loves basketball as much as I do, because I can tell you love basketball. So really appreciate you for bringing me on.
Oh yeah, man. This is a podcast I've been doing for about 2 years now. And my main thing with it is in season, we watch so much basketball. 2 years ago, I was doing it every single day, game by game by game film, right? I was watching film on, okay, how does Walker Kessler provide so much impact as a rookie player defensively, right? Like those are the talks that I love to overly indulge myself in. And there's going to be more of that as well in season. But I take these off seasons as time to really evaluate all 30 teams. And I love talking with people who love basketball and are very passionate about it, as I am at a high level. We're sickos, and the NBA needs more people like us. So love being able to spread those positive vibes and the energy to the conversation for sure.
100%. And hey, I appreciate you also fighting through the sickness. That's not easy to do. I get it. But hey, you love basketball. I love basketball. Appreciate you having me on. And hopefully we can do this again soon.
Absolutely, Noah. Absolutely. Well, I will say, peace out, people. Have a good one. Again, all of Noah's content will be in the description box below. Catch you guys in the next pod. Remember, basketball is almost here. Lock in and prepare for the next season of NBA Hoops. Peace out, people.